The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning, as if everyone could sense something unusual was about to unfold. Judge Frank Caprio glanced at the next case on his docket, expecting just another routine traffic violation. But when the young woman stepped forward, confidently adjusting her blazer, the room seemed to shift. Her name was Madison Clark, 23 years old, sharp-eyed, and unmistakably self-assured. She carried herself with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime watching legal battles from the front row. Behind her stood her father, Richard Clark, a seasoned attorney with decades of courtroom experience. He watched her with a mixture of pride and caution, knowing exactly how dangerous confidence could be in front of a judge who valued humility and truth above all else. But Madison didn't hesitate. She stepped to the podium, lifted her chin, and launched into an explanation filled with layered legal terms, case references, and polished textbook arguments. For a moment, the courtroom froze, not because they doubted her intelligence, but because they had never seen someone so young speak to Judge Caprio in such an assertive, almost challenging tone. Even the prosecutor, Anthony Rivera, raised an eyebrow, curious to see how far she would go. She spoke as if she were arguing a major case before a higher court, confident her legal jargon would overwhelm the judge and dissolve the minor violation instantly. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, observing her with calm eyes that had seen decades of human stories unfold. He didn't interrupt. He simply let her finish, let the silence settle, and let her believe, for just a moment, that she had taken control of the room. But when he finally lifted his head and prepared to speak, the atmosphere changed. The entire courtroom stilled, sensing that Madison Clark was about to hear the kind of law that wasn't written in books, only understood through life. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the Providence Municipal Court as people shuffled inside, clutching tickets, documents, and worries. Among them was Madison Clark, 23 years old, confident posture, sharp eyes, and an air of someone who had grown up surrounded by polished wooden desks, legal books, and courtroom vocabulary. She carried herself with calm familiarity, but beneath her composed surface, she was fighting the pressure of expectations that had followed her all her life. Behind her walked her father, Richard Clark, a seasoned attorney with decades of courtroom experience. He wasn't officially representing her today. This was a minor traffic violation, but he had insisted on coming. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of protectiveness, or maybe because he expected Madison to carry the Clark legacy as flawlessly as he always had. People around them whispered quietly. Some recognized Richard Clark from local news segments, while others simply noticed Madison's confident stride. But the judge presiding that morning, Judge Frank Caprio, was already reviewing the docket, unaware of the unique dynamic heading his way. When Madison's turn approached, she straightened her shoulders, adjusted the cuff of her blazer, and rehearsed lines in her head. Not ordinary explanations. Legal phrasing, structured arguments, carefully crafted terminology she had absorbed from years of observing her father. She had been raised to believe that precision and authority were the keys to being taken seriously. Even today, facing a simple speeding violation, she felt compelled to prove something to her father, to the courtroom, and perhaps most of all, to herself. Judge Caprio briefly glanced at the next file before him. The name on the ticket caught his attention, Madison Clark. Then he looked up at the young woman standing confidently at the podium and the older gentleman beside her. There was no intimidation in the judge's gaze, only warmth and curiosity. He had seen people from every walk of life, but something about this pair stood out. Richard kept a small, proud smile as he took a step behind his daughter, letting her speak first. Madison cleared her throat, preparing to present her explanation as though this were a graduate-level legal exam rather than a simple hearing. She believed she was ready for any question, any challenge, any moment. What she didn't expect was the subtle shift Judge Caprio's presence would create. A shift that would soon turn the courtroom into a place of learning she hadn't anticipated. Anthony Rivera, the city prosecutor, reviewed the paperwork with mild interest. He had encountered self-assured defendants before, but he sensed this situation carried a deeper story. The way Madison stood, the way Richard hovered, the neat organization of documents in her hand. Every part of her reflected someone molded by law, discipline, and expectation. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Madison was nervous. Not of the fine, not of the violation, but of disappointing her father, a man whose reputation had shaped her entire life. And on that ordinary morning, in a courtroom Madison thought she understood perfectly, she was about to learn a lesson about the law that wasn't in any book she had ever read. Judge Caprio was about to show her the difference between knowing the law and understanding justice. Madison Clark stood at the defendant's podium, the confidence on her face slowly being replaced by the realization that this was nothing like the debates she'd practiced at home. Judge Frank Caprio observed her quietly, noticing every shift in her posture, every flicker of her eyes toward her father seated behind her. Richard Clark, a respected attorney with decades of courtroom experience, sat still, hands folded, watching his daughter navigate a situation he could not step into. The charge was simple, a speeding violation in a school zone. But the tension in the room was anything but simple. When Madison began speaking again, her voice carried a sharper edge than before. She tightened her grip on the podium, her words crisp and precise. Your Honor, the statute clearly states that enforcement relies on proper signage visibility, and in this case, based on photographic evidence, the sign placement creates reasonable doubt. The courtroom shifted subtly. A few people looked at one another. Some raised eyebrows. Others leaned forward, intrigued by her boldness. The prosecutor, Anthony Rivera, adjusted his tie with a small sigh. He had seen confident young defendants before, but this was different. This was someone attempting to spar with the judge himself, someone who had watched too many legal arguments from the comfortable safety of her father's world. Judge Caprio listened without interruption, letting her finish her statement in full. But his expression remained warm, calm, and utterly unshaken. When Madison paused, expecting a counterargument, the judge simply folded his hands. Let me understand this. You're saying the law doesn't apply because the sign wasn't positioned perfectly? Madison allowed a brief nod. Yes, Your Honor. Under subsection, she began reciting a long, detailed statute reference. The courtroom seemed to shrink around her, the weight of her own words suddenly building. She could feel her father shift slightly behind her, not in disapproval, but in the quiet understanding that she was heading down a difficult path. Judge Caprio leaned back, studying her with patient eyes. That's a very ambitious interpretation. His tone wasn't harsh, but Madison felt her stomach tighten. Ambitious was not what she'd hoped for. She wanted to sound professional, knowledgeable, like someone worthy of carrying the Clark legal legacy. She continued anyway, determined not to lose ground. Your Honor, I believe the law supports my argument. If enforcement is compromised by inadequate warning, then Rivera stepped forward for the first time, giving his full attention. Your Honor, the signage is visible. The defendant was photographed exceeding the limit by 12 miles per hour. School was in session. Children were present. There is no ambiguity here. Madison's jaw tightened. But Judge Caprio gently raised a hand, not to silence her, but to guide her. Before you say anything more, let me ask you something. Do you genuinely believe the sign confused you? Or you try to argue just because you can? The question hit her harder than she expected. It was not confrontational, it was honest. And it forced her to confront the gap between knowing the law and understanding it. Her confidence hesitated. I'm presenting the legal framework that applies. And you're doing it well, the judge said. But the law isn't only about technical arguments. It's also about reason. Her eyes flickered downward. For the first time, she felt the courtroom watching not a highly trained future attorney, but a young woman struggling to prove herself. Judge Caprio continued, his voice steady. Let me ask you this. Were you in a hurry that morning? Madison didn't answer at first. Then she admitted, I was late to work. And the children crossing the street, did you see them? She hesitated again, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face. Yes. The judge nodded softly. Then the law was working exactly as it should. Her father's expression softened behind her. Rivera stepped back, sensing the shift. The courtroom grew quiet, the atmosphere now charged with a different kind of tension, one not rooted in legal argument, but in truth slowly coming to the surface. Madison's facade wavered. The polished lines she'd rehearsed no longer helped her. She stood there, confronted not by the law, but by her own intentions. And she realized Judge Caprio wasn't challenging her knowledge. He was challenging her understanding of responsibility. The courtroom grew still as Madison's earlier confidence softened into something more fragile. Judge Frank Caprio watched her carefully, recognizing the subtle shift. The way her shoulders loosened, the way her voice lost its edge of practiced terminology, the way her eyes avoided his. He had seen nervous defendants, intimidated defendants, even angry defendants. But this was different. This was a young woman who had spent her whole life trying to live up to a standard that didn't truly belong to her. Judge Caprio folded his hands gently and spoke in a softer tone. "Madison," he said, "I want you to forget every law book quote you've practiced. Just tell me, in your own words, what happened." Madison hesitated. The courtroom felt suddenly too bright, too quiet. She took a breath, and her voice carried a tremor when she finally responded. "I was trying to help my dad," she said. "He always says I should learn the real system, not just what I see in textbooks. And I thought if I sounded like I understood the law, I wouldn't embarrass him." The words hung in the air, vulnerable and unpolished. Richard Clark's face softened with sudden guilt, and his previously firm posture slumped by an inch. He hadn't expected her to say it out loud. He certainly hadn't expected it to hurt. Judge Caprio looked at her with warmth. "Madison, nobody comes into this courtroom to impress me. They come here so I can help them understand what's fair. And fairness doesn't require perfect vocabulary." Madison's composure cracked at the edges. Her voice dropped even further. "I wasn't trying to disrespect the court. I didn't want to disappoint him." Her father blinked slowly, realizing the weight she had been carrying. For years, he had built his reputation on sharp reasoning and flawless articulation. He never imagined that his daughter interpreted that as pressure instead of inspiration. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, less like a courtroom and more like the center of a necessary conversation. Judge Caprio turned slightly toward Richard Clark. "Mr. Clark, your daughter isn't standing here as a lawyer. She's standing here as a young person trying to do the right thing. Sometimes the right thing doesn't need perfect phrasing." Richard exhaled, his voice unsteady when he replied. "She didn't disappoint me, Judge. I disappointed her if she thinks she needs to perform to make me proud." Madison's eyes lifted, surprised. She had expected critique, instruction, or correction. Never this. Her father's sincerity created a ripple through the room, softening even the prosecutor's expression. Anthony Rivera stepped back, sensing this was no longer just a routine violation or procedural conversation. Something personal had broken open, something meaningful. Judge Caprio leaned forward just a bit, lowering his voice, guiding the moment to its heart. "Madison, let me tell you something I've learned in 50 years on the bench. The law isn't about sounding smart. It's about understanding people. And you did something today that many seasoned attorneys fail to do. You told the truth about why you acted the way you did." Madison swallowed, the tension easing from her posture. She no longer looked like someone trying to emulate a lawyer. She looked like a daughter trying to find her place in the world. Judge Caprio continued, "You don't need legal jargon to stand up for someone. You only need sincerity. That is the real law." The courtroom was silent, except for Madison's controlled breathing. What began as a simple courtroom proceeding had transformed into a defining moment for a young woman who finally recognized that her value didn't come from sounding like her father. It came from being herself. Judge Caprio's gentle smile completed the moment. "This court isn't here to judge your vocabulary. It's here to guide you. And today, you've shown honesty, courage, and heart. Those qualities will take you farther than any memorized legal phrase ever could." The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted the moment Madison finished speaking. Her voice had steadied, her posture had softened, and for the first time since she walked in, The sharp edge of competitiveness had disappeared from her expression. She sat quietly, almost humbled by the weight of her own realization, and waited for Judge Frank Caprio to respond. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the bench as he studied her with thoughtful eyes. His gaze was no longer concerned or firm. It carried something gentler, something closer to hope. Madison sensed it, and her shoulders relaxed as if she had been waiting for that reaction all along. He cleared his throat softly. His voice, when it came, was warm and steady. "Madison," he said, "the law your father practices is the law written in books. But the law that lives inside this courtroom, this is the law of people." Madison looked up, meeting his eyes. Something in her demeanor had changed completely. She was no longer here to prove herself, but to understand. Judge Caprio continued, explaining that true justice doesn't come from perfect terminology or flawless arguments. It comes from recognizing the human being standing in front of the bench. He reminded her that compassion was not a weakness, but a responsibility, especially for those who hold legal power. The courtroom listened in complete stillness. Even the prosecutor, Anthony Rivera, watched with surprise at how different the tone had become. Richard Clark, Madison's father, had lowered his head slightly, almost ashamed yet quietly proud that his daughter was finally hearing what he had never managed to teach her himself. Judge Caprio turned his attention to the case itself. The violation Madison had challenged was minor, and in normal circumstances, it would have required only a simple explanation. But what mattered now was the intent behind her interruption, the desire to protect her father and prove she understood the world he lived in. After a long moment, Judge Caprio announced his decision. He dismissed the charge, stating that the court found no harmful intent, and the situation had escalated only because of misunderstanding and emotion. Then he addressed Madison directly once more. He told her that she wasn't far from becoming an excellent lawyer, not because of her vocabulary, but because she had learned an essential truth that many take decades to understand. Madison listened with quiet gratitude. Her eyes softened, not in defeat, but in genuine growth. She understood that today had changed something inside her. She had walked into the courtroom ready to prove she was smart. She walked out knowing she wanted to be wise. When the session ended, she approached her father. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, proud but humbled, recognizing that Judge Caprio had given his daughter something he never could, a lesson not from law school, but from life. Madison looked back at the judge one last time before leaving, and in that brief moment, she understood exactly what real law meant. As the gavel finally came down, a quiet settled over the courtroom. Madison Clark stood, her shoulders slightly relaxed, her eyes glistening with the weight of what had just passed. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward, his gentle smile warming the room. "Remember," he said softly, "the law isn't just about words or fancy phrases. It's about fairness, understanding, and seeing the person behind the case." Madison exhaled, a mix of relief and newfound clarity washing over her. For years, she had been taught to wield legal jargon like a sword, to impress the court with complexity. But today, she had learned something far more powerful. The true essence of law lies in compassion, honesty, and human connection. Her father, Richard Clark, nodded from the audience, pride shining in his eyes. Even City Prosecutor Anthony Rivera, who had sat stiffly through the proceedings, offered a respectful glance, acknowledging the lesson Madison had just embraced. Judge Caprio's eyes swept over the courtroom one last time. "Every case," he said, "is a story of people, not papers. Treat them with dignity, and justice will always find its way." Those words lingered, echoing softly in every corner of the room, leaving a mark not only on Madison, but on everyone present. As the crowd began to stir, the camera captured the subtle smiles, the small nods, the quiet realization that they had witnessed more than a legal lesson. They had witnessed a moment of genuine humanity. Madison left the courtroom that day changed, carrying with her a wisdom no textbook could ever teach. And for everyone watching this story unfold, let it be a reminder: Empathy and kindness are just as vital as knowledge and skill. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and share so that more people can see the real power of justice and compassion. Stay tuned for our next story, where another courtroom miracle reminds us that even in the toughest cases, humanity always wins.